Let's start by going through what brumation actually is and how it presents. During brumation, the daily activity level, the metabolic processes will drastically slow down or cease entirely in response to reduction in things like the temperature, the hormone levels, thoughts on barometric pressure, daylight hours. So essentially, these things slow down when we're heading into cooler temperatures or winter. The animal will enter into a state of inactivity or reduced activity and go into a period of dormancy, which reduces the requirement for their energy input, so food, and it also slows energy utilization and output of the energy systems. So in layman terms, what this means is the animal is reducing their activity, they're eating less volume, and they're sleeping a lot. Now, there's still many people that do refer to brumation as reptile hibernation. Technically, it's still correct. In scientific texts, particularly these days, some scientists do still use the word hibernation instead of brumation. Essentially, what we're looking at, it's a biological management process that's designed to conserve energy and thermal energy in winter. So in the wild, in these periods, there is less food availability in winter. There is also less opportunity for prey around them in general. Now, we might start by answering one of the most frequently asked questions that we have here. Why is there so much different information about brumation, and why can people be told one thing versus another? Now, it is very true there is still a lot of debate over brumation and whether it is good or bad for captive reptiles, whether they should or shouldn't be doing it. You may have also seen a lot of conflicting information online or be given different information from different vets, whether they're sort of against or supportive of brumation. Now, it's very true that we do advise against brumation for inexperienced owners, largely because of the fact they can't determine or distinguish between a brumating animal and signs of brumation versus a sick animal. Now, in contrast, when we look at our experienced owners and our experienced breeders, they do take a really methodical and researched, stepped approach into brumation. These ways are much better. So there are actually right ways and wrong ways of brumating, which is something we will go through today. Now, it's really worth stressing, and something that really owners sometimes don't understand fully is that you may not have any choice at all. You could try your very best to force brumation on an animal, or you could try your very best to delay it or suppress it, but sometimes you're not going to be able to do anything that's going to make a difference. So remembering that brumation is a biological, hormonal, and instinctual response, it means that your attempts to delay, suppress, encourage brumation can entirely end up pointless once those biological responses do take over. So often this means that it does come down to the individual animal itself, and it's not consistent when we're looking at the species as a whole. So what that means is just because John's bearded dragon might brumate, it doesn't mean Jane's will, and they could be from the same clutch living in the same house. There is no consistency between individuals, but there are patterns that we see between the species. Now, brumation, as we sort of touched on lightly before, can be essential to reproduction and health. So you might find your quality breeders really strongly advocate for brumation, and there'll be periods that they do not sell or they're not available to the public because they're investing in the health of their animals, which is really, really beneficial to the overall immune health. And it's really beneficial to the type of bearded dragon that you'll essentially end up taking home. How do we know if our animals are brumating or heading into brumation? Great question. So this is where things can get a little bit tricky for the newer or the inexperienced owners, or even for owners that might have had a bearded dragon for some time, but it's never brumated and suddenly it is. What we want to look at are the signs of illness versus the signs of brumation. Now, this is where it becomes really essential to know your bearded dragon. You're going to be the best advocate for what is normal in your animal, and also why we strongly advocate for health checks with your vet. These really can't be sort of overvalued. They're one of the best tools you can do to keep on track of your bearded dragon health. Book a vet. So what happens in those appointments? Your vet will weigh the animal, check the body condition, going to assess the scales. We'll have probably a fecal analysis, or you can ask for a fecal analysis. Things that they're looking for inside of that will be things like your coccidiosis, pinworm, crypto, all sorts of other parasites, even exoparasites, mites, for example. These will help determine if your animal is medically fit for brumation, and also we can start now focusing on the signs of brumation. Now, these can include reduced or no appetite, so they might eat less or refuse food. There will be a change or reduction in fecal output, so the volume may get smaller or it may get darker, for example, as they're winding down their food intake. So we have to remember it's a balance. What goes in has to come out at some point. Now, you might find them sleeping or being more lethargic than normal, spending more time in hinds. You might actually find them trying to burrow underneath the substrate, sometimes can be days at a time to begin with, leading into weeks at a time and eventually months. Now, they are known to spend more time in their cool zones and will spend less time basking. Another thing to sort of be mindful of is they come out to bask later. So typically in winter, we're looking at a reduction of sunlight. There is less sunlight in winter. So it means that the bearded dragons are coming out later to bask. Not that they're not coming out at all, it's just at a later time. Now, they are likely to also show some really vigorous signs of avoiding handling. You can see an increase of things like biting, tail whipping, thrashing, because they don't want to be disturbed in this period. So leave them alone. Now, once bearded dragons are actually in brumation, they've been asleep for a couple of weeks, some of them do undergo really prominent colour changes. They can become quite dull, a little bit grey, a little bit pale looking. This is quite normal within limits, which we'll discuss. Now, again, just touching on the last thing there, coming out later to bask and spending less time. This is really key. So get familiar with when your bearded dragon usually comes out to bask and when he gives up basking, remembering that they should not be basking all day. If your bearded dragon's basking all day, your enclosure's not set up right. There is no, argument to that. If they bask all day, quite simply your enclosure is not right. So what they should be doing is what we call biphasic basking. Now, there are other scientists and people in the industry that use that term as well, because it really is what it is. So biphasic, meaning there's going to be two phases or sometimes multiple phases. Typically what we will see, and this can be very much sex dependent, is coming out in the morning, hiding in the peak of the day, coming out again in the afternoon or the evening, and going back to sleep. So that's what we want to see. We don't want to see a bearded dragon just sitting in the same spot all day long. So let's have a look at a common question. Why brumate? What's the point? One, we already know that generally you're not going to be able to stop it. It's biological and instinctual. But some benefits as to why. Now, when brumation is managed correctly and safely, it actually has a lot of well-known positive benefits and can actually improve the overall health and well-being of your animal. So in the biological systems, in the background and all the way in the wild, these animals have instinctual processes and hormonal processes that are linked to season, which we will also get to a bit down the track. Now, we have seen in captivity and some sort of early on studies and some newer ones coming out that show that bearded dragons in particular that are allowed to brumate have longer lifespans, they are healthier, and reproductively they are in better health, so better reproductive health. Now, good breeders and quality breeders will always brumate because it promotes the healthy reproductive cycle. So when we're looking at things like spermatogenesis, when we're looking at things like progesterone levels, mating behavior, all those types of things are important when it comes to brumation. Now, we've also seen in captivity that it has been shown to substantially reduce captive stress. And this is in a number of species. So from our lizards, skinks, snakes, turtles, it's really beneficial for stress. Something that's very common in reptile husbandry and reptile care is reptiles living in a permanent state of chronic deprivation is what I like to call it, or chronic stress. Let's have a chat about the parasites. So with parasites, what many keepers, I guess, are not aware at a general level is the role of thermoregulation in other important body or health functions that are driven by the bearded dragon itself. So this can include things like parasite control, immune health, disease processes and activation as a whole. Now, from studies, we do know that basking and maintaining PBT, so your preferred body temperatures, for bearded dragons plays a pretty big role in parasite numbers and parasite burdens within the gut microbiome. So we also see this in captivity. So where we have bearded dragons that are kept in a lower basking temperature, lower ambient temperatures, they are not able to reach PBT, or they're not able to maintain it, which means that we're putting them in a position they are more prone to parasite infection, and they're more prone to disease, and they're more prone to other disease processes. So these are the things that happen in the background before they may become clinically unwell. Now, if you've ever had your bearded dragon treated by the vet for coccidiosis, for an example, you may have actually been told by them to slightly increase your basking temperatures or slightly increase the overall ambient temperature. Now, this is for several reasons, but two of the main ones is that many medications for reptiles cannot metabolize at all unless the animal reaches PBT. This is how it actually enters into the liver, into the kidneys, and through the body systems, and how the medicine actually works. Now, the flip side of that is that we also know many of these parasites cannot survive above certain temperatures. So by having that slightly higher, we're actually assisting the reptile to clear that parasite load. Now, during cooler months and in brumation, or with bearded dragons in captivity that are not maintaining PBT, or they're not able to reach PBT, we do know that these numbers can actually increase. They suddenly become unwell, or they may have a parasitic burden or infection. Another general factor to consider when it does come to brumation, whether to brumate, not to brumate, what vets are looking at, is the overall immune system, the health of the bearded dragon, and are there any illnesses or diseases at play? Reptiles are very, very good at masking signs of pain and illness. Sometimes reptiles can actually be sick for months or years at a time. They can be what we consider chronically unwell for a very long period, but have almost no visible or clinical signs, particularly that might not be obvious to an owner. Now, they're able to maintain fairly good homeostasis through consistency, proper thermoregulation, good nutrition. So they sort of just stay at this nice, stable level. Nothing super bad happens, nothing super great. We're just, we're plugging along. Now, if the lights and the heat are just suddenly turned off, and we've decided that, yep, Tuesday, we're doing brumation, we have then thrown the bearded dragon into a situation where it can suddenly become sick. It can be that tipping point into clinical illness. And essentially, we are looking at a situation of it can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So this is coming back again to why do we say safe brumation? We're not just going to come home one day and say, yep, I'm going to throw off all the lights. We're going to brumate now. No, we do not want to be doing that. We need to be mindful that any change in consistency can tip the balance of your immune system and your bearded dragon. So we want to make sure we are managing this safely. Moving on to our next consideration, dehydration. Now, clients that know me well know that I bang on about this all the time, dehydration and hydration. Historically, winter and midsummer are the two periods that I tend to see beardies that are suffering from chronic dehydration. Now, with vet colleagues, researchers, people in the field, this is consistent nationwide. There's a number of reasons for this, but what I'm going to focus on here, particularly for brumation time and winter time only, is two things: the heating and the lack of drinking water. Now, winter is often a time where keepers will suddenly switch to all these different types of heating sources without any sort of thought as to how the light works. As in, what is it heat? What type of heat is it producing? What is the goal of this light bulb or heat source, for example? A lot of people will see things online and they will mimic what they see. They will rush out to add a heat mat and they'll add a heat cord, and suddenly we have a DHP and we have a whole lot of heat sources in there, making our enclosures really, really hot and really, really dry. Now, this is a problem. So in winter, it's cold. The temperatures are getting cooler and the daylight is getting shorter. So we don't want to be rushing out and adding in heat, adding in DHP, adding in all sorts of things, which is exactly the opposite of what happens in brumation. Now, if you have a sick reptile, and we're going to address that a bit down the track, if you have a sick reptile and your vet has said you need to avoid brumation at all costs, excellent. We will start looking at appropriate heating sources. Now, DHPs, the deep heat projectors, are something I'll never recommend for bearded dragons. I've seen firsthand time and time again how dry the airspace is inside of the enclosure, and we test this. So we test things like air purity and air flow inside of enclosures when we're also doing the thermal mapping. Deep heat projectors are terrible, in my opinion. I won't recommend them. Now, these actually do contribute to dehydration in bearded dragons as well, particularly when they're not getting enough water. Now, it is a big thing we see. Again, I use Facebook a lot as examples just because it's such a great source of incorrect information. It's easy to find. So we will often see things like, put your bearded dragon in a bath, it's going to drink out of its cloaca, spray it with a heap of water, and people that will double down on things like the particle size of the misting spray because it's going to absorb through the scales. No, just simplify the process of hydration and dehydration. We need the bearded dragon to be drinking. It's as simple as that. Now, do bearded dragons drink out of water bowls? Typically no. We have a couple that may, but again, coming back to your wild type bearded dragons, I have worked all through Northern Territory, Queensland, WA. I have never in my entire life, not even once, out of the thousands of bearded dragons I've seen, I've never seen one sitting in a dam or a creek or anywhere else where there's a water body having a drink. What I do see is I see them getting water off of grass in the morning times. I do see them getting water off of leaves and tree branches. I do see them licking rocks and condensation. So those sorts of sources we can mimic in captivity. It's actually quite easy. One of the simplest things I say to owners who say, oh, my bearded dragon doesn't drink water, there's two really easy ways we can hydrate. So we can get our woody, for example, or our cricket, dunk it in some water, feed it to the bearded dragon. Now, use tongs for this. Don't let it jump around because then we'll end up with a cricket lamington that's covered in sand. Dip it in some water, give it to the bearded dragon. Every time you dip an insect in, that insect's covered in water. So little bit by little bit, we're increasing. Now, using the dropper method, which was actually taught to everyone in our, I think, first or second session and in the husbandry guys, brilliant method. On top of that, we can also use our rain drizzle method. So I might even put a link to that after this so we can re-look at hydration. Hormones and seasons. Now I'm going to keep this very, very simple. I don't want to overload you guys with too much of the science behind it and blood readings and things like that. We want the information in a way that we can use it. Otherwise, what's the point, if nobody understands it? Now, breeders must be aware that brumation plays a role in reproductive health and overall health in the bearded dragon. The reason I stress the word must is because I bang my head against the wall consistently speaking to breeders who do not understand the importance of it or the importance of your hormones. So in the wild, for example, when we're looking at bearded dragons, we will actually see that they do naturally have a high fecundity rate. They're also capable of producing 2 to 3 clutches per season, and they do have a pretty high success rate for each clutch. Now, what's often not replicated in captivity is any of that. So breeding success rates are lower, the pairing rates are much lower, the viability of the eggs is much lower. Now, all of this is actually in despite of and complete contrast to breeders having a controlled environment and ample resources. You would think that we are able to improve breeding standards, but something I've seen over the years is many of them are declining. Now, we do see many breeders who will push their animals to the extreme year round and try to force continual breeding, which basically means we're denying brumation. Now we're going to have a look at the year and some key time frames that are important to our bearded dragons and also important to bearded dragons in the wild. I will just actually address, I am doing my session outside again today, guys. You know how I like outside, so do apologize for the noise. Let me know if it gets too much. So what we have here is our January through to December timeframe. Very basic, not much information there. Now we'll see in terms of when the animals start slowing down and when we might start to actually notice a change in our bearded dragons. Typically can be as early as February, which is way away from winter. So we can actually start to notice changes in February, more so towards March, always by April and May. Now, some people will have bearded dragons that will go into complete brumation and they're asleep by March. We've got others that will sort of progress more steadily over the course of a couple of weeks before going down in the winter period. That's okay. If you've had your vet checks and your fecals are okay and everything else is okay and your husbandry is good, great. Now, we also have to remember that biologically where these animals come from, these temperature changes do start happening in February. They do start declining in March and April. So I think there is this preconceived notion of, oh, okay, winter's in June. My animal has to go to sleep in June. Doesn't quite work like that. So what we'll start to see basically from our February, March and April is that slowing down, the reduction in basking, for example, the reduction in food, more sleeping. We're not going to jump into that too much because we're diving into that in the next section. This is more so for the breeders. We're going to see this diagram again. Now, winter period. So we do have our typical June, July coming into August. Now, where I want breeders to pay attention, or to anyone that is sitting there thinking, great, I've got two bearded dragons, let's make babies. No. What we want to know is the breeding period and the months there and why they're actually important. Now, our pink line is our progesterone for our females. The blue line is the testosterone for the males. Now, we're ignoring quite a lot of the female hormones here. I've done that on purpose. One, there's some of them that actually have been shown to not have a very big effect on the females, the same as mammal species, but I want to focus on the ones that are most important. So in August, we can see that in the females, the progesterone level is rising and rising and rising. Now, it will hit its peak in September, so right at the start of spring, getting ready to breed, and it will be maintained throughout the breeding period. Now, throughout that period as well, there's a lot of things going on in the background, egg production, follicle production, so there's a lot happening in the background. In contrast, when we have a look at the males, we see that right after brumation and when they're waking up, we're slowly seeing a rise in the testosterone. It's going to peak in September before suddenly declining the whole way through the season to December. Now, it will then return to normal. The male will brumate, and then we have that cycle again. So to those breeders who think that brumation has nothing to do with hormones and nothing to do with breeding, it does. At the end of this document, there is actually references to scientific papers which will discuss all of this in more detail, but it does actually show the importance of brumation to breeding adults. So I'm going to just jump back. We've got a question here about a phrase that I used, which has invoked some feelings. So I've used the term controlled deprivation. Yes, I use that on purpose. It's actually also used a couple of times in other scientific papers as well, so I can't take credit for that. It's a term that I really like. What do we mean by it though? Owners, we got the enclosure, we've got the lights, we give it food. We're doing a great job, aren't we? No, not necessarily. So reptiles historically in captivity are renowned for being kept or living in a state where they're chronically deprived of something. So that's why I call it chronic deprivation. Now, whether this is sort of permanently living in a state of chronic dehydration, whether they do not get any enrichment or outdoor time, whether they are in an enclosure that's far too small, whether the nutrition just consists of bok choy and mealworms and absolutely nothing else. There are so many considerations that go into providing a great environment, a good environment, and a poor environment. So what we always want to look at when we're considering the bigger picture and we're wanting to improve our husbandry and our care is we want to do it in a way that makes our quality of life for our reptiles better. We want to make it so that they have better health and that they live longer. We want to make it so breeders are producing good reptiles instead of sending out reptiles that die within the first 18 months. But the good thing for an owner is that yes, while it might be expensive to get that bigger enclosure, to get the Arcadia light instead of the Reptile 1, or to get a thermostat instead of none, yes, there's a big outlay. But this comes at an offset of control and less stress. We typically find in husbandry visits that when we're coming into homes and the owner's got a bearded dragon in a 4-foot or a 6-foot, it has a thermostat and it's got an Arcadia light and everything's all set up well, those owners are always calmer, they're more receptive to information and learning. The bearded dragon itself is typically more settled, typically more healthy, typically doing all the things that we want to do. Now, enrichment is a big one. Those that have already done the enrichment session, sorry guys, there's a bird fight going on. We talk a lot about enrichment and how that improves quality of life. So brumation, I actually put into the category of controlled deprivation. Because when we're forcing bearded dragons to stay awake and trying to make them act normal throughout the year, 365 days a year, this isn't beneficial to their health. It has been scientifically proven several times that brumation is beneficial for immune health, quality of life, all sorts of things. So that's why I do use that term. All right, guys, we are getting closer to the end. So that's taken a little bit longer than we would have anticipated. Some of those questions we'll tack at the end. Now, we're going to race through these considerations really quickly because we've actually deep dived into a lot of them already. So we'll race through a few of these very quickly because we've already been through them. But we will jump a little bit deeper into the question of somebody's actually asked us in the background, how do I know if I'm using a good breeder and I'm not already buying a sick reptile? So we will jump into that in a moment too. Observations. So remember, you are the best advocate for your reptile. Get to know what it is that they do on a day-to-day basis, year-to-year, month-to-month. Have a health diary. We sell health diaries. Most of you already have one. There's free apps that people have created online. There's books. You can text yourself, put it in your phone. There's nothing worse than heading off to a vet and the vet actually says to you, when was the last time that your reptile did a poo? And an owner stands there scratching their head because they genuinely don't know. Weight is a consideration before brumation. So we want to make sure that our bearded dragons are not underweight, they're not sick, they're not chronically infested with parasites, for example. Weight is a thing that should remain stable, stationary, and constant during brumation. Remember, brumation is a period of dormancy. We're stationary in a certain, time point in our life. We should not be losing large amounts of weight in brumation. You should be weighing your animal before brumation. Your vet will also weigh your animal for you, and you can also weigh your animal during brumation. It's about the only time we sort of say it's okay to interrupt them. Age. What age should we be looking at brumation for our bearded dragon? We've actually also had a question pop up in the box below from Jason. He's asked, what point do we know when it's safe to start brumation? Because I've always been told that I can't brumate less than 12 months old. That's true. but don't worry about it too much. It's one of these things when we're jumping back to remember that it's instinctual, biological, hormonal, all these types of things. A younger bearded dragon typically won't brumate in captivity anyway. So if you are maintaining your enclosures at a constant and you're bringing them through that period, they typically won't brumate anyway. But we do want to make sure that we're not letting our newborn hatchlings brumate because they don't have the weight to sustain it. The very important thing here, particularly with babies or animals under 12 months old generally, is it's a peak growth period here. So for the first 12 months of life, this is where we see the bearded dragons go from being an egg to a little baby hatchling growing into the subadult phases. This is the peak period when they also eat the most amount of protein in their life before they start switching over to a more primary plant matter based diet. So we don't want younger bearded dragons brumating because we're essentially stripping them of that ability to go through that peak growth phase period. So in captivity, I find it's never really anything we have to worry about. I've probably only had a handful of juvenile beardies that have tried to brumate, and they're really not that young. Some of them are about 9 to 11 months old. So we were sort of on that fence of whether or not we should or shouldn't be. For me, when it comes down to consulting with an owner, I make the decision on obviously information from the vet once they've had a health check, but also how experienced is this owner. If it's a first time owner, absolutely not. If it's a guy who's owned a bearded dragon for 7 years, sure thing. Remembering and recapping very quickly, we are making sure that our bearded dragon is hydrated and that we're not heading into brumation chronically hydrated. We've done our fecal checks and we've gone to the vet to actually make sure our bearded dragon's healthy to brumate. Also, this helps us to determine if there's any underlying illness or disease that hasn't been presented clinically yet, so that when we start to turn the lights off or the temperatures drop, we're not throwing them into a catastrophic event. So remembering our camel, we don't want to be the straw that broke the camel's back. Injuries we haven't really touched on too much, but it should go without saying if your bearded dragon is injured, we're not going to brumate, particularly if you have had recent surgery. Again, this comes back to the fact that if they're on medications, they're not going to metabolize well into the system, but the immune system itself is dampened during these periods. So when it's colder, the immune system doesn't work as well. So it means that in terms of our recovery rate and our healing, this will be slower. So no brumating and speak to your vet. Seasons and knowing where you are. This one will amuse me more than it probably should, but I use the example here, and I might actually ask everyone that's on the Zoom with me, type in where you are for me. So let me know what city you're on. Don't need your address, just tell me where you are. Then what I want you to do is go and have a look outside the window. It's daytime, so just tell me sort of what are we looking at? What's out the window? How sunny is it? Something that never ceases to amaze me when it comes to brumation is, I'm trying to think of a way to say this delicately, the amount of people who think that we are just out here living in the darkness, that we are in Antarctica, none of us can see anything, and it's pitch black, freezing cold, and we're all a bunch of Eskimos. In Australia, that's really not the case. So remembering we've got shorter daylight hours, and we've got lower maximum temperatures. We're not sitting in the pitch black. So it does actually surprise me sometimes when people say, oh look, I'm just going to flick off all my lights. I've seen people go as far as wrapping the enclosure in foam and insulation, dropping sheets over the top, and it really is pitch black. Look, they do go underground and they do spend a lot of time in their hides, but it's worth knowing that bearded dragons do also come out to intermittently bask on warmer days as well. So beardies in captivity will do the same thing. Now, there's some areas, and I'm very conscious that not all of us here are from Southeast Queensland. So some of us live in areas where we really don't get much of a winter, Whereas here, we consistently get to 0. Some people might consistently get to 18. I try to steer clear of giving advice on lighting on forums like this because we're all from different areas. But one thing we can agree on is in winter, none of us is sitting in the dark. Absolutely none of us. So get to know your season. Something you may have noticed as we were scrolling through those slides, and it may actually be worth pausing here if you're listening online, but also for anyone that has the information packs, having a look at your A4 documents. It does show an example brumation schedule here. So we recommend having vet checks about February, March, really good time to get a look in at your fecal counts, for example, and then your brumation schedule. On those blue slides, you can actually see we've got the headings there: May, June, July, August, September. In each of those slides, it also shows you what we've adjusted our thermostat to. So moving from 14 hours of daylight to 12 hours of daylight to 10 hours of daylight to 8 to 6. We do not turn off lights here. Obviously, it's an independent choice to the individual and depending on what your vet says and what you do at home. But remembering, we're not in the pitch black. We're not 0 degrees all day long, every day. The temperature goes up and down during the day, but we do know that the days are shorter and the days are colder. So what we do here is we aim to gradually reduce the heat and light over time, so that through winter, our clients here, and what we do is we have a 6-hour lighting schedule, but we are keeping the basket light on all the time at 42 degrees. So if you want to have a read, go back through, read your documents. Anybody that wants that document, let me know. I'll re-email it through again. But the main thing here is we're not just coming home one day on Tuesday going, yep, Bob's in the dark, lights off, here we go. No, we're going to gradually step down. As we are nearly at the end. So accessories, what are we brumating in? What are we doing with our animal? And I'm going to actually throw in 2 questions we've had in the pop-up box. Now, in terms of where do bearded dragons brumate? So in the wild, typically they're digging burrows in the substrate. They're wedging themselves in under rock. They're going down, basically. In captivity, what we see is bearded dragons will brumate wherever they feel safe. So whether this is making a little burrow themselves in their own substrate, whether they're ripping up the horrible reptile grass and going under that, whether they're using a commercial hide or one that you've made, for example, they will go wherever they feel safe. Now, accessories inside enclosures. Now, this is also something I bang on about constantly, and I love using Facebook for examples. There are groups on Facebook that if you're part of, just leave them right away. Bearded dragon lovers, for example, just get rid of it. You'll lose a few IQ points. Now, the reason why I say that, never ever in 4 years of stomping around in the bush through Northern Territory, WA, South Australia, Queensland, I've never in my life come across a bearded dragon chilling out on a leather couch. Not once. Surprising, I know. Some of the things that are sold to people for bearded dragons or that people will buy themselves, including leather couches, bunk beds, fairy beds, plush mats, photo frames, all the rest of it, you've just been conned. They're no good for bearded dragons. They're not utilizable. That's what we need. What's the function? What can they be used for? What benefit do they give? All of those items give 0. Things that are beneficial inside the enclosure. Rocks, excellent. That's really good for nail health, joint health, shedding, femoral pores, so many things. Sand, they can dig in it. That whole debate of sand is bad. No, it's not. Your husbandry is bad. Maybe sometimes with the babies, actually, I make allowances there. Sticks. So sticks and climbing ladders, bird ladders, things like that. Excellent. Things they can climb up onto. They are a semi-arboreal species. More often than not, I see bearded dragons in just flat, boring enclosures. When we do a calculation of how much space has the owner utilized, it's less than 20%. They have 80% of the enclosure there in vertical space that hasn't been used. Really great tip I tell everybody, don't bother buying one of those $40 reptile hammocks. Don't waste your money. Head to Bunnings, go to the section where the floor mats are, buy a seagrass mat, buy 20 of them, they're $3. Put one of those in, they're really, really great. Now, back to the point, brumation and where they sleep. They'll sleep where they're comfortable. We don't need any of that other junk. So let's buy things that are actually utilizable. Let's have a look at, after this video, I want you to just spend some time on Google. Google central bearded dragon, eastern bearded dragon, pygmy bearded dragon. Have a look at them in nature. What's around them? What are they on? What are they doing? Where are they? this is a conversation that sometimes can get quite heated, and I can actually see messages popping up down the bottom already. It's another topic I don't make apologies for. There's good husbandry with good accessories, and there still might be, good husbandry with poor accessories. And then there's some really stupid accessories. If you have a look at any reptile vet, every one of them will have pictures of bearded dragons that have been stuck in silly things. Alrighty guys, so that's the end of the main section for brumation for standard owners and individual owners. We've got quite a lot of questions that have come up down the bottom about breeding, brumation, ethical breeders, and some of the subjects we've touched on, particularly in relation to good quality breeders versus poor quality breeders, and why we specifically say that. If you're done learning about brumation, you can fast forward all the way to the end for your frequently asked questions. Anyone that wants to hang about, feel free. Addressing the inevitable, questions about breeders and why it's important. Now, I actually find that new owners and existing owners are far more receptive to this information than what long-term breeders are. Some of the most common things that you no doubt would have seen, and I've definitely seen, is breeders or keepers that may have a lot of experience and they've been in the field for a while. They, do know certain amounts of things in certain amounts of areas. Nobody knows everything. Something that we see consistently that's lacking, and this isn't just from myself, this is from also speaking to other vets all over Australia, is breeders that really don't know that much about breeding. So it's this consistent pattern of having breeding adults, putting them together, get some eggs, sell them off, do some more, that's about the end of it. Now, every season, we do meet new breeders that are wanting to breed their, first clutch. It's their first time breeding, or existing breeders that are approaching us wanting higher volumes or creating new fancy breeds and wanting to know how to do it. But something that I do also see is that they don't understand the bare basics of physiology, hormones, basic genetics, or even the effects that brumation has on the endocrine system, reproductive systems. We speak to breeders that don't even understand the foundations of nutrition. Only this year, I spoke to someone who was looking at getting into breeding that had no idea what gut loading was. These foundational, fundamental things are things you should know. Now, there are also some breeders who may force year-round breeding. So they will deny the brumation period. They will keep their breeding stock in sort of subpar enclosures under full light, hoping to just keep breeding them through and through and through. Some of them have never had a fecal test or a vet check, and they just don't think it matters. But the reason why it does matter, and why particularly it should matter to the person buying these animals, let's have a look, because we've got some examples. How it matters and why does it matter? These breeders are affecting the gene flow and creating genetic problems within inside the breeding pools of bearded dragons. There are some breeders who are flooding the market with very weak genetics. There are some breeders who are flooding the market with sick animals, so coccidiosis, and we have an example on this, parasitic outbreaks. We do see bearded dragons that have failure to thrive. Some of them have mutations. Some of them have injuries. We have many who are given incorrect care and incorrect husbandry advice. A lot of the problems that we actually see, and this is common to pet shops, mass market pet shops, stay away from them. Find your specialist or smaller stores that actually deal with reptiles and exotics, because you're more likely to get good quality information. The amount of owners that come home with red lights for a bearded dragon is still quite ridiculous. But at a breeder level, we do find this as well. There are breeders on social media, for example, that you can go and have a look at the pictures they put up online that do not even have correct configuration for the lighting. So they may have their UVB and their heat light on the complete opposite side, and they will then go and tell that to the person who's buying a bearded dragon off them, then continuing the cycle of misinformation to all of those that get a bearded dragon. Now, we'll often see beardies that are being kept in poor conditions, which means they've got a poor start to life. So in those fundamental growth periods and peak developmental phases when they're with the breeder, they're then coming through to the owner and they've had a crappy start to life. So it is important. And health conditions over time. Now, we won't go too much into this because it is a bit more in-depth, but there is a problem with some silkbacks and leatherbacks that we're starting to see through time now that they've been in the market for a little while. We do know that there are issues with hydration and water loss in these bearded dragons. We do also know that UVB strength and position do have an effect on some of these bearded dragons as well. So with a lot of these fancy breeds that are coming out and they're newer into the market, and leucistic breeds and things like that, these breeders often, and I won't say all because there's a couple, but often don't have an understanding of things like, phenotypes or gene flow and how this actually affects the bearded dragon later on down the track. Now, if we simplify that down to the most basic level of all, what does this mean for the buyer? You get a sick reptile, or one that's less likely to thrive, or one that's not going to be as healthy as others. Now, we do have a direct example of this from a direct Southeast Queensland breeder who's pretty big into bearded dragons. I'm going to post a link to that separately because it is fairly long, but essentially a known bearded dragon breeder, incorrect lighting, doesn't do vet checks. Ourselves have had 6 clients with 6 bearded dragons over different times affected with coccidia. 4 of those are now deceased, 2 of them failing to thrive, and we have actually spoken to other owners sort of outside our client database in the same situation from the same breeder. So it does matter. Look into your breeder and research your breeder. And again, just coming back quickly to the people here who are the breeders, I am pointing the spotlight on you directly, and I always will. I will always hold you accountable here. When you are taking money for somebody's animal and you are profiting off an animal, and sometimes it can be thousands to tens of thousands every season, you have a responsibility not only to your own animals and breeding stock, you have a responsibility to the animals that you are selling, and you do have a responsibility to the owner. So coming back to Mr. But I've Always, make sure you're giving correct advice, make sure you are producing healthy animals, make sure you're listening to clients if they actually have a problem. You've taken their money, you've sold a service, be held accountable, or other people will hold you accountable.